Good morning, or whatever time of day it is where you are, from Vienna, Austria, from my living room here. And thank you for being here and watching. In my presentation today, I will talk about the syllable, by which I mean both syllabic structures in writing and in phonology. And I will ask the question of whether syllabic structures might be more natural and salient than segmental structures, and address possible reasons for why that might be. The structure of the presentation will be as follows. At first, I will provide a bit of background into my personal angle of grapholinguistic research and my motivation to ask the question that this talk addresses. Turning then to the phonological syllable, I will present different types of evidence that has been used to argue for its primacy in writing. I will then explain how, against the background of a modality-indifferent structural definition of the syllable, there are, ironically, modality-specific syllabic structures in speech and writing. And next, I will then turn to those writing-specific suprasegmental and specifically syllabic structures. Before I close the talk, I will raise a number of questions. As usual, my talk raises many more questions than it gives answers, as to a special status of so-called segmentaries or segmental writing systems. I will then conclude and give an outlook. My motivation in basically everything I do in grapholinguistics is the attempt to arrive at a functional and explanatory theory of writing. And this is actually also what I devoted my PhD thesis to, which will be published later this year. So my goal is to move beyond description, which is utterly necessary and important. We need description, but to move from description towards explanation. The question should then not only be how writing systems are structured, but why they are structured the way they are. For that, given that a basic assumption of functional and usage-based approaches is that use shapes structure, we also need extra linguistic evidence and interdisciplinarity. What I did in my thesis now is based on many existing lists of criteria that have been proposed for practical, optimal, effective, perfect writing systems, to carve out evaluative and comparative categories, which I chose to call fits, because they capture how writing systems suit given requirements and needs. The first two of those fits are descriptive. The systematic fit tells us how systematic the relationship between the units of writing systems are system internally, while the linguistic fit evaluates how well a writing system fits the language it is used for. For example, how the writing system of German fits the German language. The other two fits are constituted by human nature and human needs. The processing fit, on the one hand, assesses how well writing systems meet both physiological and cognitive needs, while on the other hand, the sociocultural fit asks very central socio-communicative questions and cultural questions, which, given that writing is a cultural technique and deeply embedded in culture, is very important, and the sociocultural fit often dominates the other fits. These fits can be evaluated at different levels, the universal or system-independent level, the typological level, and the system-specific level. And some fits are more reasonably investigated at one of those levels. For the processing fit, for example, the universal level is paramount, I argue, and this is where this talk today is located, asking how the syllable could be universally salient in processing. At the typological level, we can ask whether some language types, such as the isolating type, preferentially correlate with types of writing systems, such as morphography, or more specifically, morphosyllabic writing. And at the system-specific level, we ask why or how specifically a writing system suits its given language and its users' needs. At this level, the most specific level, sociocultural questions are often located. Of course, the bottom line is that for an explanatory theory, at least in a first step, universals are of utmost importance. The basic claim with which I want to start, and which has been made in various iterations, here by Jeffrey Sampson, is that the syllable is more natural than the phoneme. A disclaimer at this point, a reviewer pointed this out, and it is very important but not to the question of this talk, the discussion of syllable versus mora. Here, it is not exactly pertinent as both are suprasegmental units in phonology, and the central opposition here is segmentality versus suprasegmentality. Now, we have different types of evidence that support such a claim favoring the phonological syllable. In phylogeny and mostly structurally, we see that the first inventions of writing spawned syllabaries, but notably morphosyllabaries. So the correspondence with phonological syllables could be, as is the case today still in Chinese, only indirect, and the morpheme is instead primary. However, also modern grammatogenies have resulted in syllabaries, and crucially also when, or especially when the inventors were not literate in any other writing system or did not know about writing, which Peter Daniels calls unsophisticated grammatogenies. Structurally, of course, the phonotactics of a language and the number of possible well-formed syllables is paramount for a decision whether to adopt a syllabary or a different type of writing system. Largely from ontogeny and of psycholinguistic nature, we have other types of evidence, such as the old shoe that syllabic awareness precedes segmental phonemic awareness. Also in instruction, syllabic methods seem to often be superior to segmental ones, etc. And a claim that was once controversial, but has, I feel, been somewhat accepted is that the phoneme is an epiphenomenon of segmental writing. The syllable arguably existed before the invention of writing, whereas, as is argued, the idea of segments was projected from writing onto speech. I have some more evidence from processing, which I also mentioned in my abstract. First, from handwriting, where in an interesting study with monolingual French and monolingual Spanish, as well as bilingual French-Spanish writers, the durations of intergrapheme intervals were measured. These were longer at syllable boundaries than intrasyllabically. And a grapheme combination that is of special relevance here is GN, which is intrasyllabic in French, which you see in the example consigné, and has a syllable boundary between it in Spanish. Now, even bilingual writers produced a shorter interval when writing this combination in French. The same in this digital day and age goes for typing, where keystroke intervals are longer at syllable boundaries. And another very interesting and important study, I think, concerns the learnability of writing systems. Here, participants were instructed to acquire or learn invented writing systems, each group a different one, segmental, Moraic, syllabic writing systems. And the group that performed best acquired the syllabic writing system, which also actually points to a possible crucial difference between moras and syllables, just as a side note. The authors thereby see their so-called acoustic stability hypotheses confirmed, by which they assume that units of writing that correspond with larger chunks of speech are easier to acquire than graphemes with segmental correspondence. Also, importantly, all participants had an alphabetic, that is a segmental, writing system as their first native writing system, but they still performed better with the type of writing system that they were unfamiliar with, the syllabic one. Now let's turn to a broader syllable definition, actually a modality-indifferent one. In an attempt to highlight structural parallels in the different modalities of spoken and sign languages, Beatrice Primus proposed a definition that hinges on an alternation between more and less salient units. This structural definition is abstract and indifferent to modality, but crucially, what counts as salient is substance-dependent and thus modality specific. In speech, what is more sonorous is more salient. In sign language, movements are more salient than locations. And in writing, we need to look at visuality, like literally look at visuality, or to be less visuocentric, materiality in general, because writing can be haptic as well, of course. So generally at graphetics. This means that salience in writing systems is dependent on the scripts that they use. And I want to just say that the way I define scripts is as inventories of visual basic shapes, devoid of any linguistic values, so purely graphetically. take Roman script as a very ostentatious example, which is coupled with so many languages for so many writing systems. The visual properties are always the same, but græafematik values of shapes can differ from system to system, of course. In short, visuality is central. And the consequence of this structural syllable definition is that there are unique syllabic structures in all modalities, and only after they have been discovered independently should we look for correspondences between them to avoid putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. This then leads to an ambiguity when we speak of written syllables or written words or written sentences. As we can mean either of two things. We can mean a unit of writing, which can be visually, graphetically, subsegmental, segmental, suprasegmental, that corresponds with a phonological syllable, word, sentence, etc. Or what we can also mean is a suprasegmental, or as I call it, polysegmental, structure in writing itself that is characterized by an alternation of more versus less salient visual units, independently of any correspondence with a different linguistic subsystem, such as phonology or morphology. This ultimately is a methodological and in turn also terminological choice that also reflects how one models the relationship between speech and writing, either as a dependence or as a correspondence. The latter is the case in German grapholinguistics, which highlights the autonomy of writing and writing systems. Here, different types of suprasegmental units have been proposed. Not only the gʁafematik syllable that is at the center of this talk, but also the gʁafematik word that we will hear about in the next talk, and the gʁafematik sentence that we heard about in the previous talk. And let me just mention that I think it's funny that we all, in these first three talks, talk about suprasegmental written structures and all have questions as our titles for our talks. Back to these designations, they are somewhat problematic as the use of syllable and word in these designations implies or insinuates a dependence of writing on linguistic subsystems such as phonology, instead of highlighting the structural parallels between language systems and writing systems, which these terms are actually intended to do. Let's take a closer look at this gʁafematik syllable. It was first defined in this particular way by Nanna Fuhrhaupt and Franziska Buchmann in 2009. And in essence, it hinges on the visual length of basic shapes or parts of those shapes, their heads. By analogy with the sonority hierarchy in phonology, a so-called length sequencing principle is assumed, which reads, the gʁafematik syllable core is occupied by the most compact grapheme. The length of the segments increases monotonously toward both syllable edges. And you can see the prototypical structure of it here, which is longest at syllable edges and most compact at the center of a syllable. And this is an English example where you see the structure falling and here rising again. And length here is exhibited by descenders as in this P shape or ascenders as in the K, which extend beyond the central space of the line and into the high and low spaces. Notably, in German, gʁafematik syllables often correspond with phonological syllables, but not always. There are thus idiosyncratic features of this gʁafematik syllable that actually warrant an autonomous methodology like this. Similar visual structures can be found in other alphabets, and I have examples here from Greek and Armenian, where ascenders and descenders appear to have similar functions of indicating syllable boundaries. But crucially here it is phonological syllable boundaries. So here the two types of syllables coincide completely. But this is also only a very preliminary analysis, an observation I have to say, so more data is necessary here. In Cyrillic, a script that is like Roman script used for many writing systems, we don't have these structures, as there are anyway very few shapes with ascenders and descenders. And here the U, grammatically an U, which we know as Y, serves as a syllable nucleus, which is a grave violation of the length sequencing principle. Questions do remain, for example, about the status of diacritics, such as here in Greek, the accent, which are also located in the high space in these cases, but for these details, the time today does not suffice. We also find autonomous suprasegmental structures in other types of writing systems, for example, in abugidas or akshara-based systems, where we have so-called aksharas. These are composed by vowels and optionally a consonant or consonant cluster in the onset, but not in the coda. So vowels may be preceded but not followed by consonants. This, of course, is not the case for syllables in these languages. And Peter Daniels, in his book, An Exploration of Writing, gives this example. And you can see in this word here, which I will not even attempt to pronounce, we have this here as an akshara, which Daniels mentions is clearly not a syllable. This is just to show you quickly and briefly that such autonomous suprasegmental structures occur not only in alphabets. Notably, however, abugidas are also segmental writing systems, if a special type. I will come back to that in just a bit. I want to highlight a rather bizarre situation. If the lowest level of correspondence that the basic units of a writing system relate to are phonological syllables, the graphemes in this writing system will be graphematically segmental, despite their syllabic correspondence. We then speak of syllabographic graphemes, which are segmental, as opposed to graphematic syllables, which I just presented, which are suprasegmental. The former is the case, for example, in the Japanese kana indentries, in which we have segmental syllabographic graphemes. In other words, units that correspond with phonological syllables, or again, moras. I do not want to get into this discussion, which is an important discussion. Thus, here we also, in the marked situations in which we only have the kana inventories in Japanese, we also have the situation where the spacing between the graphemes indicates units that correspond with phonological syllables. But this is, of course, not the case in the unmarked prototypical use of Japanese, where the component scripts are mixed, because the kanji, of course, are morphographic, and the morphemes that they correspond with are often polysyllabic. In Chinese, graphemes, or the spaces between them, also indicate phonological syllables, but as I mentioned, only secondarily or indirectly, by means of Chinese being morphographic and the morphemes having monosyllabic, mostly monosyllabic phonological representations. Korean Hangul is also an interesting example, as here graphemes which correspond with phonemes are actually graphetically subsegmental and combined spatially in these segmental syllable blocks, which then correspond with phonological syllables. So Korean is actually a segmental writing system, but it is syllabically spaced, so to speak. Well, as to the question that I mentioned, I would raise, are there suprasegmental structures also in those systems? We know that they also don't have word spacing, so what could visual features be that reveal these structures to us? And another important question, are written segments visually more salient than suprasegmental structures, such as the gʁafematik syllable in German or English, for example? And are segments in writing thus primary? And probably the most important question, is it more natural when the primary unit of writing, which is arguably a segment, corresponds with the primary unit of speech, a suprasegmental chunk, whether a syllable, mora, etc. And this brings me to my last point, a possible special status of segmental writing systems, or segmentaries, as Gnana Desikan has called them. And circling back to the epiphenomenal nature of the phoneme, segmentality is a property constitutive of writing that has been transferred to speech. So segmental writing system, as they are based on structures inherent to writing or features inherent in writing, may have more possibilities to develop autonomous græafematik structures. Interestingly now, most segmentaries We've seen the gʁafematik syllable in alphabets, aksharas in abogidas, and Arabic has also been claimed to show Morayic structures. So most segmentaries appear to develop visually salient suprasegmental structures, which crucially, of course, largely correspond with suprasegmental phonological structures. And now you might say, well, it's only logical and actually largely trivial to say that if a writing system is segmental and corresponds with spoken segments, that is phonemes, a combination of written units will only naturally and logically correspond with a combination of spoken segments. Well, yes, but that doesn't explain phenomena such as the visual cues given by ascenders and descenders showing us syllable boundaries. And this is also not accidental, it's a rather systematic feature. Indeed, for German, we actually find several diachronic changes that might have occurred led by human pressure to establish and strengthen a salient gräfematik syllable structure, such as one example is the ousting of the shape that we already encountered in the Cyrillic script for Russian, the Y shape. So to oust this shape from the syllable nucleus, as it has a descender and should only occur at syllable edges. So my final question is, if a segmental stage was reached in writing systems in form of a segmentary, and even if it just sounded like that, I do not want to promote teleological ideas, is there a movement towards depicting or corresponding with syllables? This is similar to how it is sometimes assumed nowadays that there is a movement back towards iconicity, if you consider the use of emojis, for example. Onto the conclusion already, for which I elevate the specific questions back to a more general and global level. What do the questions that I raised mean for grapholinguistics? Well, first, I argue that typology needs to become more fine-grained, which Rüdiger Weingarten, for example, has also suggested. And there are first proposals, such as the very sound and elegant one by Amalia Gnanadesikan, I think, for phonemic writing systems. The focus should not be exclusively on those units of operation in writing, I call them graphemes, that correspond with the linguistic units constitutive of a writing system's type up to this day, in the traditional sense, meaning phonemes, syllables, and morphemes, on which typologies are to this day largely based. Instead, we should focus also on larger units of writing that are inherent to the writing system, meaning they can be defined independently of phonology, morphology, syntax, and also in a second step, of course, their correspondence with suprasegmental units of language, such as syllables, words, sentences, etc. And with regard to this question, we lack not only explanation, which is unsurprising given the state of grapholinguistics, but also for writing systems other than German, description. And finally, to sort of close the circle, grapholinguistics, in my opinion, must move a little from description to explanation. And different types of evidence must converge to uncover these explanations for why certain structures occur in writing systems and crucially, why they recur in the world's writing systems. And to achieve that, we of course need communication beyond disciplinary boundaries, which is why conferences such as this one are so vital. And I am very thankful to Yanis for organizing it, especially during such a crazy time. And I'm very much looking forward to all of your talks in the upcoming 3 days. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention and am now hopefully ready for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dimitrios. We have our first question by Martin Durst.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, my question is about the example of French and Spanish. In French, the NG is the way I would pronounce it or so, is a single phoneme, yeah? So this example alone it would just show that inside phonemes, if a two-letter phoneme, then phoneme is written with two letters, then these two letters might be written closer together than if these are two separate letters that correspond to separate phonemes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this doesn't necessarily show that there's something, that this is a syllable that makes this difference. It could also be on a lower level.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say that I think what these authors also did is to assume an autonomous sort of processing route for writing as well. So to assume that in writing, we do not always need to go through sort of the phonological route and to think of or activate the phonemes associated with each combination of graphemes or single graphemes. But yes, of course, it's an important influence and an important factor that needs to be considered.
We have 3 more questions. So next one by Cornelia Schindelin.
Mm-hmm.
So Cornelia would like to point out that there are polysyllabic morphemes in Chinese which are consequently written using a string of 2 or more characters. Maybe that means that characters are more tightly bound to syllables than to morphemes.
Okay, thank you for the interesting comment, yes.
Okay, third question by James Myers.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, I've never used Zoom before. Yeah, just a quick advertisement for my poster tomorrow. If you check the page, I already have the slides up. I argue for something like syllables in Chinese characters, but not corresponding to spoken anything. So
Yeah.
just, I don't build on primus, but it's basically the same idea. So there's sort of an orthographic constituent that seems to be useful. But I'll see what you think, because it's maybe a little wrong, but we'll see.
And a question by Ben Young.
Sorry. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So my question was, so in Baxter and Segar's reconstruction of Old Chinese, they reconstruct Old Chinese as having multisyllabic morphemes, so probably sesquisyllabic morphemes. In this case, the individual unit of Han writing system is still referring to a single morpheme, but the morpheme consists of more than one syllable. Would this mean it's kind of an outlier in terms of these sort of ex nihilo writing systems that are using syllables as a basic unit?
I would not say so, because as I mentioned, it could be the morpheme that is central in those systems, and that it was just sort of, not an accident, but that it just happened to be languages where many of the morphemes were monosyllabic. So I wouldn't call it an outlier, because I think probably the most salient unit wasn't actually a meaningless phonological unit, the syllable, but was probably a meaningful unit, the morpheme, in the first place. Just my, historical grapholinguist, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
And a last short question by Dan Harbour.
Hi. Gosh, I've got 2. I guess I just wondered where you would put Hebrew and Arabic in this, because the writing systems have word final descenders in a lot of cases. So it looks like the prosodic unit that seems to be important there graphologically is the word more than the syllable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't looked at them in detail yet, but I would say that, well, at least descenders being word final does not sort of contradict the assumption of these suprasegmental visual structures and these boundary cues. But it's an interesting, thank you for the comment of the syllable not having these descenders. So yeah, I will have to look at that more closely.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Dimitrios, for your nice talk.